So, you want to make a webcomic, do you? If you clicked on this video, there's a pretty good chance you're either thinking of starting a webcomic in the future, or you've already started one and are looking for some additional advice. In which case, hi! I'm Star, and welcome to my channel. I've been making webcomics for over a decade, and I want to help you make your comic the best it can possibly be. Webcomics are incredible. There's so many talented creators out there who decide to make webcomics just for the love of creating and sharing their stories with the world, and most of them can be read entirely for free online. I mean, come on, how cool is that? However, a lot of folks starting on their webcomic journey can fall into various storytelling, artistic, and marketing pitfalls that can hinder their comics pretty significantly, myself included. When I first started making webcomics, I made a ton of mistakes. Mistakes that I've learned from and now want to help you avoid. Which brings us to the topic of the video, where I'll be going into detail on some of the biggest things you should never do in your webcomic, as well as why you should never do those things and how to avoid them. But first, let's do our usual, hey Star, what you drawing? So, you guys might have seen some of my other videos with tips and tricks about making webcomics. But did you know I wrote an entire book on the topic? Because I did! How to Webcomic: The Ultimate Guide to Making Online Comics is a fun and educational book that teaches you everything I know about making webcomics in one convenient package. The first edition of the book came out in 2021, and I'm now currently raising money on Kickstarter to fund a print of the second edition, which has been revised and updated with over 70 pages of additional new content to teach you how to make your comic the best it can be. The Kickstarter campaign is live until May 5th, and if you support the project on Kickstarter, you'll get a discount on both the physical and digital editions of the book, and be among the first to get your hands on the new edition. The link to the Kickstarter campaign is down in the description. Oh, and the art in the background is me drawing the cover for the book. So, yeah. Anyway, let's get into the video. Here are 10 things you should never do in your webcomic. Things you should never do in your webcomic. Number 1. Don't start your comic with a long, info dump, exposition-heavy prologue. We are starting this video with a controversial one. Oh boy. So this one is a big pet peeve of mine personally, but I know a lot of other folks agree. If your comic starts by dumping several pages of dense, lore-heavy world building right off the bat, it can be a major turnoff to your potential readers. The start of your story should have some kind of interesting hook that makes the readers want to keep reading. It should not be a barrier of entry people have to slog through to get to the actual story. 9 times out of 10, throwing a bunch of lore and names and history at your reader without context doesn't make people interested in the story you're about to tell them. It'll probably just bore them. If I open up a new webcomic and it spends the first, 10 pages going on and on about 1 million years ago the gods ruled the world and then they fought and everything caught on fire and then the world was made of fire, but then the fire was conquered by the water and the fire stopped and the gods learned how to get along and also created people and the magic of the realm and the temples to the east and the west that housed the holy archaic artifacts that could destroy the world, and the people created robots, but the gods didn't like the robots, so another war broke out. I'm probably just gonna close that tab and never come back. If I'm reading a webcomic, I want to feel like I'm reading a story, not a dang history textbook. Now, if the lore is a big part of your story and you have to get it on the page right away so people understand it, there are more artful ways of doing it that don't involve just yeeting 10 pages of dense world history into your new readers' faces. Avatar: The Last Airbender does this pretty well. They introduce the concept of bending early on via dialogue between the two main characters. Instead of being exposited directly to the watcher, you understand it because you can pick it up from context clues and conversations between the characters. Other stories introduce world building by just having the characters exist in the world and talk about it naturally over the course of the story. And you, as the reader, get it because you can pick up the world building just by watching the story take place in that world. If the storytelling is done well enough, you might never need the world building exposited directly into your eyeballs because you'll be able to learn about the world naturally through context. Long story short, please don't make me read the entire world history of your setting in the first handful of pages. I see this really often from less experienced writers, and it honestly drives me up the wall. Introduce your story, introduce your characters, give me a reason to care, a hook to keep me interested, and work in the world building and lore of the world naturally over the course of the story. Moving on to things you should never do in your webcomic number 2, never draw at 72 DPI. So let's have a brief talk about image resolution, because this is something I didn't learn until embarrassingly late in the game, and some of you might be falling into this problem too. If you don't know, when working in digital art, you have the option to set your art's resolution. Imagine a 1" by 1" square. Your image's resolution is basically how many pixels or dots fit inside that 1" square. The higher the resolution, the higher the DPI, or dots per inch, the more pixels are inside of that space. For most programs, by default, the resolution will be set at 72 DPI, 72 dots per inch. This is the standard for web images. If you're reading a comic online or looking at any other image, like a meme or something, the pictures you're seeing will be at 72 DPI. However, you never want to draw your comic pages at 72 DPI. Why? Printing. 72 DPI is way too low of a resolution to use for printed works. If you try to print an image at 72 DPI, it's gonna look really gross and crunchy. The bare minimum for printed works is 300 dots per inch, well above the default 72. If you ever have any dreams of making a printed edition of your webcomic, you'll want to work in 300 DPI from the jump. Even if you don't think you'll ever make a printed edition of your webcomic, working in 300 DPI is still a really good idea. After all, it's a lot easier to shrink down your images to 72 DPI than it is to blow them up to 300 after you've already drawn them at a lower resolution. I actually know this from experience. My first webcomic, the first chapter or so, was drawn at 72 DPI, and when I decided to try and make a printed edition, I struggled a lot with having my art be too small to really look good when printed. And the quality of my book suffered a lot as a result. Learn from my mistakes, always draw at 300 DPI or higher, you will thank me later. But that brings us to, how do you set the resolution of your art? Usually when you make a new document in your art software of choice, you'll have the option to set the dimensions and the resolution as well. You can also change the resolution of an existing art document, but note that just increasing the resolution won't actually increase the quality of art that was already drawn at a lower resolution. For best results, you'll want to set your resolution higher before you ever start drawing. How you do this varies from program to program, so I can't include guides on how to do it for every single one. If you're unsure of how to do it in your program of choice, or you can't figure it out on your own, I recommend Googling how to set resolution in name of art program and seeing if you can find some tutorials from there. Alright, moving on to things you should never do in your webcomic number 3, have bad lettering. I know the phrasing on that one is a little weird, but basically, no matter how good the art and writing of your webcomic is, if your comic bubbles are badly done and hard to read, people aren't going to read it. Full stop. So, how do we avoid bad lettering? Well, this is a pretty big topic, but I'll run you through some of the basics. Number 1, you'll want to make sure you pick a font that is easily legible. Please, for the love of all that is holy and sacred, don't pick a font like this for your lettering. If I get a headache trying to parse what your characters are saying, I'm just gonna stop reading your comic. Number 2, make sure that your line spacing is big enough that the text is easy to read, but not so spaced out that it looks like a high schooler's double-spaced English essay. You might have to fiddle with the line spacing depending on what kind of font you're using. Number 3 is that you should also make sure your letters are horizontally spaced out enough that they aren't running into each other. This can cause legibility problems, but you don't want them to be too spread apart either. If you're unsure of how to change these settings in your art program of choice, I again recommend Googling how to change font settings in name of art program. Number 4, generally a lot of comics stick to an all caps font. This is a byproduct of early print comics having somewhat low quality printing, and all caps fonts were easier to read at smaller, more condensed, and lower quality sizes. However, for webcomics, this generally isn't an issue, so don't feel pressured to use an all-caps font if you feel like mixed case would suit your comic style better. And then lastly, number 5, make sure that you're giving your text room to breathe inside the word bubbles. Text like this looks cramped and haphazardly shoved into a too small word balloon, and I've also seen some comics that like to shrink wrap their word balloons around the text, which is, why would you do this? This is so hard to read. This is a nightmare. You should also always make sure your text fits comfortably inside your word balloons. A general tip I learned is that you should always be able to fit a capital H in the corners of your word balloons. If there's not enough space, make your word balloons a little bit bigger. If there's more than enough space, you might consider making your balloons a little smaller. Additionally, I have an entire section on how to do effective lettering in the How to Webcomic, so read my book, link in the description. Alright, next up. Things you should never do in your webcomic number 4, pick a genre just because it's popular. Allow me to tell you the tale of two webcomic artists. We'll call them A and B. A and B both want to make a webcomic and are in the idea gathering phase of their prep work. A loves making comics, and because they love science fiction, they decide to make a sci-fi comic, even though sci-fi isn't the most popular genre. B also likes to make comics and reads a lot of webcomics on platforms like Webtoon and Tapas. B sees that romance comics are super popular on platforms like those. B wants their webcomic to be popular, so they decide to try making a romance comic even though they don't really care much about the genre. Their priority is making a popular webcomic so they can be a popular comic creator. Both A and B start posting their comics online at the same time, and as is common and expected, they both start out with a relatively small audience of readers. They don't have a lot of subscribers and don't get a lot of comments. A is a little saddened by this, but continues to make their sci-fi webcomic, because they love sci-fi and they love making their comic and sharing it with people who also like the genre. B, however, gets frustrated because of their small readership. If romance comics are so popular, why isn't my romance comic popular, they say. After only a few months of posting, B gets so frustrated by their lack of success that they quit making their comic altogether. So, what can we learn from this story? If your goal is to make a webcomic, you should make something you're passionate about, not something you only want to make to get popular. If we're being honest with ourselves, most webcomics don't make much, if any, money. Webcomics are a hobby for most creators, and even though some can earn revenue on platforms like Patreon, 99% of webcomics never even come close to making a living wage. Most webcomic artists make comics as a hobby, or as a way to boost their portfolio, or to improve their art and writing skills, not necessarily as a way to pay the bills. So if you're working on a comic fueled by your passion, don't you think it makes more sense to make something you're passionate about? Doesn't it make more sense that you'd want to make something you enjoy and have fun creating? I understand the desire to make something that's going to be popular, but if it comes at the cost of your own personal enjoyment, then maybe consider why that popularity is the most important thing to you. One of the biggest pieces of advice I have for making webcomics is to be your story's biggest fan. It's much easier to stay motivated to work on your comic if you genuinely love what you're making. If you choose to make a comic based on only what's popular and not what you personally enjoy, the likelihood of burnout is much, much higher. And since building a regular fan base for a comic takes time, usually several months to years before you start seeing real traction, focus on making something that makes you happy, not something that you think will make you famous. In a similar vein to the previous tip, things you should never do in your webcomic number 5, make a comic just for the money. This one has started fights in my TikTok and YouTube comments when I mentioned it in the past, but I still fully stand by it. Despite what some people might think, webcomics are not some kind of get-rich-quick scheme. You might look at hugely popular comics like Lore Olympus and think, wow, look how popular that comic is. They must rake in a ton of cash. I will also make a webcomic and get famous and make lots and lots of money. However, I'm coming at you hard and fast with a hammer called crushing your dreams. Webcomics are not a get-rich-quick path to guaranteed success. Making a comic is not going to guarantee you a lifetime of success and a stable job. Making a webcomic, even a successful one, likely won't be the catapult to huge financial gains some people seem to think it is. Building a fan base takes time. It'll probably take years of consistently posting your comic before you start to see any meaningful financial gains from it. I've been in the webcomic scene for over a decade now, and I know people who've been making webcomics even longer than me struggle to earn even a small amount of revenue from their work. I've known people who've quit their jobs to focus on making a webcomic they think is going to make them rich, only to crash and burn when their attempts at making money from it fail and they have to crawl back to a day job to make ends meet. It's not impossible to make a successful webcomic, and it's not wrong to want to be successful. With a lot of hard work and a lot of luck, some folks are able to make their webcomic their full-time job. But bear in mind that for every success story you see, there's 100, maybe even 1,000 people who failed. Now, again, I'm not saying you shouldn't try to make money off your comic. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to get financial support for your time and efforts. If you're able to garner financial support to help you keep your comic running and support you, then that's amazing. And if you can work your way up to earning a livable wage for your webcomic, then that's awesome. I'm super proud of you. That must have taken a lot of work, and it's really impressive. What I'm saying is that if you start making comics with the expectation of making $1 million and being mega famous, if your only goal with making a webcomic is to make money from it, you're likely going to get disappointed. Most people making webcomics do it for the love of the craft and the joy of creating, not the love of the success it brings. And if you're relying on that success alone to motivate you, you probably won't succeed at all. Food for thought. On the subject of money, let's talk about some of the ways you might try to make it, shall we? Things you should never do in your webcomic number 6, run a crowdfunding campaign before you've actually made the comic. For many webcomics folks, one of the biggest milestones is to take their webcomic from this computer screen to the page, i.e. printing a physical edition of their comic. But unlike posting a comic online, making physical versions tends to cost a lot of money, depending on how many copies of the book you're trying to make and a ton of other factors. And that cost can be really prohibitive to many artists. Enter crowdfunding. On sites like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and others, comic creators can run crowdfunding campaigns to raise money for the printing of their comics in exchange for copies of the book and other rewards being sent to backers. Crowdfunding can be a valuable resource for creators looking to make physical edition of their online webcomics. However, there are some people who try to approach crowdfunding with a different goal in mind. I've seen many crowdfunding campaigns from people trying to earn money for their webcomic who haven't made a webcomic yet. They haven't even started writing or illustrating it. Instead, they're taking the just trust me bro path to marketing their comic and trying to convince people to pay money for a series that doesn't even exist yet. Imagine someone showing up on Shark Tank without an actual product to show, just an idea of something cool that might be successful and might do what they say it does eventually. Do you think that person's going to walk out of the presentation with financial backing? Probably not. Backers on crowdfunding platforms are like investors. Show them something that's worth them spending their money on, and they're more likely to support you. Show them nothing but promises of something that might be good eventually, and you won't be getting a lot of bites. I won't be including any actual examples here because that feels pretty mean-spirited considering the topic of the video, but you can go onto Kickstarter and see past projects that failed. They still get archived on the site even if they don't meet their funding goal. So many failed comic Kickstarters are ones that tried to get money to make a webcomic rather than to do something cool with a comic that already exists. And while there may be a handful of times this has worked, I personally have never seen a successful crowdfunding campaign for a webcomic that hasn't already been written and drawn in advance. Make your comic first, then worry about monetizing it. But hey, here's a reminder that if you're enjoying my tips and advice so far, I've got a whole book full of them that's funding on Kickstarter right now, depending on when you're watching this video. And the best part is that How to Webcomic is already entirely written and illustrated, which means that if you support the book on Kickstarter now, you'll have the book in your hands by the end of the year, so that's pretty cool. Link in the description. And we're moving on. Things you should never do in your webcomic number 7, aim to make the perfect webcomic that everyone loves. So, here's the thing about perfection. It doesn't exist. You could argue that some form of perfection exists in some fields, like math, where you can get a perfect score on a test by knowing that 2 + 2 = 4 and answering all the questions correctly. But art is a field that's highly subjective and is dependent on not just the taste of the creator, but also of the audience viewing it. An art piece that one person considers perfect can be seen as terrible by someone else. One person might love your art style, but others might think it's not their cup of tea. The truth is that no one webcomic will be universally loved. No story is perfect. You could make a comic with amazing characters, immersive and in-depth world building, and a riveting and compelling story, but some people just don't like webcomics. And those people are boring. So instead of trying to make your comic appeal to literally every single person on the planet, focus on making something that you love. If you tell the story you're passionate about, other people will be drawn to that. It won't be perfect, but it will be yours. And that's something much better to aim for anyway. But what if we're talking about perfection on a more technical level? Getting the art to look just right, or constantly tweaking your story and dialogue until it's perfect in your eyes? Well, I hate to be the one to break this to you, but you're running a fool's errand. Like I said before, perfection doesn't really exist in art. Constantly erasing and redrawing a character's face over and over, trying to get the perfect expression, or rewriting a scene over and over trying to get the perfect flow of dialogue is likely wasting your time and doing you more harm than good. No comic page will be perfect. No story will ever be perfect. There will be plenty of times when you're less than enthusiastic about the page you just finished. But artists are so much more critical of their own work than their audience, and your readers won't see all the same flaws that you do. Learn to call a page done and move on. It's difficult at first, but it does get easier with time. And on the subject of trying for perfection, things you should never do in your webcomic number 8. Redraw old pages. With a little asterisk next to never because of reasons I will get into. The eternal page remake loop can be a killer for newer webcomics. Imagine you've just finished the first 10 pages of your shiny new webcomic, but then you look back at your first page and think, wow, I've gotten so much better since I drew that first page, I should redraw it. And then you redraw the first page and it looks better. And that's exciting, so you end up redrawing the second page too, and the third, and the fourth, until you've fully redrawn the entire 10 pages all over again. But then, when you look back on the redrawn first page again, you think to yourself, wow, redoing all of those pages made me even better at making webcomics. I can see so much improvement already. I could make those first pages even better if I redrew them now. And then you redraw page 1 for the third time. And then page 2, and page 3, and pretty soon you don't have a webcomic. You have 10 pages running in an infinite loop. I see this a lot from folks who are just starting their first webcomic. I understand that the idea to go back and make old pages better is a strong one, but for the sake of continuing your comic, you just gotta learn to let go. Let your old pages be and keep moving forward. Your art and writing will improve over time, and that's normal and good. And being able to see the artist's growth over time is one of the coolest parts of webcomics. Now, there is an asterisk on this point, so let's talk about some of the reasons where it's more justifiable to go back and redo old pages. One is to correct a lack of clarity. Sometimes our visual storytelling isn't perfect, and if a page is confusing or sending the wrong messages to your readers, then it's beneficial that you go back and make those changes. One of the nice things about webcomics is that you can go back and change things if needed. Your readers are all essentially beta readers in their own way. If something isn't reading clearly, you can go back and change the wording, or the art, or the page layout to make things easier for your audience to understand. The second reason, possibly the most common reason, and the one that I'm trudging through personally right now, is if you're planning on making a printed edition of your comic. If your comic only exists online, it's easy to go back and make changes as you need. But if it's going to be printed into a book, it's completely reasonable that you'd want to go back and tweak the art to make it better before spending tons and tons of money on a print run. But even in this instance, I'd advise just doing tweaks to the art rather than just completely redrawing older pages unless you absolutely have to. For example, I'm currently in the process of prepping my webcomic cast-off's first few chapters for an eventual Volume 1 printing, and the art in those early chapters is 8 years old. So I'm taking the time to go back and tweak things, fixing some anatomy errors, improving the lighting and the colors and the expressions, and fixing a few minor story inconsistencies. Both of these reasons are why there's an asterisk on the title of this section, but aside from those two reasons, I'd encourage you to let your art be what it is and focus your time and efforts on making forward progress in your comic. Things you should never do in your webcomic, number 9. Sign a contract with the publisher without understanding the terms. In general, posting your webcomics to comic hosting platforms like Webtoon and Tapas is a really good idea. It's free and easy and allows you to get new eyes on your work and can be a great way to grow your audience. And if your comic does well, you might even catch the platform's attention. Sometimes comic hosting platforms will reach out and offer to officially publish a webcomic, offering the creator a contract and a monthly salary in exchange for making the comic and posting it exclusively on their platform. To many indie creators, this can sound like a dream come true. Getting paid to make your webcomic? That's amazing. However, I offer a word of caution. If you're going to get paid to make your comic by a platform, you're going to need to sign a contract. And you should always be sure to read carefully and fully understand any publishing contract before signing. While getting your work officially published by a webcomics platform may sound like a dream come true, I've seen far too many people get taken advantage of because they got too excited and signed a bad contract. I know people who signed away the rights to their series in exchange for payment, only to have their series canceled because it didn't perform well enough. And since their contract stated that the platform officially owned the rights to that comic now, the creator could never continue that series in any way ever again. The platform essentially stole their webcomic and then threw it away because it didn't perform well, and the artist was left with nothing. I've also seen comic creators jump at the chance to be paid for making their webcomic, only to be saddled with intense workloads and monumental amounts of stress for very little pay. They've pulled all-nighters, worked 60 to 80 hours per week to keep up with their publishing schedule, caused themselves physical injury and suffered mental trauma, and got paid barely above minimum wage. If that sounds scary, that's because it is scary. Losing the right to make and publish a story that you created and love is a terrifying concept. Working yourself to the bone for bare bones pay is demoralizing and can be physically and mentally traumatizing. Bad contracts are scary. So while not every comic publishing contract will be this bad, it's always a good idea to be very careful about what you sign. Read through the entire contract and get help or advice from a trusted, knowledgeable party if you need help understanding the terms. Ask as many questions as you can and make sure you understand the full scope of what you're getting into. Getting your webcomic published can be a great opportunity, but make sure to be smart about what you sign. The terms of any contract should be beneficial to the platform you're posting on and you as the creator. The workload should be manageable and you should be fairly compensated for your work and your time. Minimum wage is not fair compensation. In addition, you should ideally get other benefits for signing a publishing deal. Will the platform be helping you market your series? Will you be part of promotions on their website? Will they be able to help you hire art assistants to keep up with their required work pace? What else are they offering you as a benefit if you sign on with them? If you want a bit of further reading about this subject, go look up the Tokyopop Rising Stars of Manga scandal and do some reading. Bad contracts are unfortunately nothing new in the comics industry, and if you can learn to spot the red flags sooner, you'll save yourself a lot of grief in the long run. And we've arrived at our final tip of the day. Things you should never do in your webcomic. Number 10, rely on external validation for motivation. I'll be the first to admit it. Comics are hard. So hard, in fact, that a lot of times you may find yourself doubting your skills. It happens to everyone, trust me. The key here is how you deal with the hardships of making comics. What kind of support are you getting from external sources versus internal ones? It's easy to fall into the trap of relying too much on external validation. Likes, favorites, subscriber numbers, nice comments, tips and donations. They can all be wonderful things to get, and they can definitely boost your enthusiasm for your webcomic. But when you're first starting out, you might not get much interaction right away. It'll take some time before you start getting regular readers who comment frequently, and it'll be a while before you start seeing substantial growth to your reader numbers. So in those early days, when you aren't getting much external validation in the form of likes and comments, sometimes it can be really disheartening. And in some circumstances, it can be disheartening enough that it might make you want to quit altogether. That's why I always recommend people rely more on internal validation. The love and passion you have for your comic should be the #1 driving force behind you making it. You should love your characters, love your story, love the comic you're creating in all its facets. You should be so excited about your story and making your comic that not doing it feels like torture. If you can learn to support yourself and keep yourself motivated, it'll make it much easier to keep your momentum going. If there's something you don't love about your comic, consider what you can do to change it. How can you make your webcomic be your favorite thing? But if you still struggle with relying too much on encouragement from others, one thing I recommend is getting in the habit of saving all the encouragement you get. If someone leaves a nice comment on your comic, draws you fan art, or does anything that makes you happy and makes you feel good about your work, take a screenshot of it and save it to a folder on your computer you can easily access. If you're ever feeling down, you can go back and look at all the nice things people say about your work. I find that keeping it all in one easily accessible place can help give you that boost of dopamine that we sometimes need to get excited about our work again. And we should always strive to be excited about our work. And that's all the advice I have for this video. There was part of me that was a little bummed about how negative I got at some points in this script. Like, I know the topic was things not to do in a webcomic, but now there's part of me that wants to make a companion video with a more positive spin, like things you should definitely do if you're making a webcomic or something like that. I already have some ideas on things I'd like to talk about, so if that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll get to make that one in the future. Fun fact, a big portion of the information in my script was either paraphrased from or taken directly from my book, How to Webcomic. If you want to learn more mistakes to avoid, as well as a ton of things you should be doing when making a webcomic, you can learn all kinds of stuff by snagging a copy of the book and reading it for yourself. It's full of tons of advice on planning a webcomic, writing compelling stories and characters, plus general art tips, as well as advice for making comics and sequential art, how and where to post your comic online, how to market your series so people actually read it, how to make money off your work, and tons of other topics. The book is written in a simple-to-understand format to keep it engaging and educational, even if you're someone with a short attention span like me. And the text is accompanied by plenty of illustrations for both entertainment and educational purposes. It's targeted at younger or novice comic creators, but it has a little something for everyone, no matter your experience level. And in addition to being educational, it's also very motivational to help you jumpstart your webcomics journey. It's like a 200-page pep talk straight from me to you, because I have a tendency to just go off and be a little TED Talky and just try to encourage people, because webcomics are cool and we should all make webcomics. Heck yeah, more comics! At the time this video is being posted, the Kickstarter campaign is still running for a few more days, so you still have a little bit of time left to back the project and be among the first to get the new edition for yourself. If you're watching this after the Kickstarter is over, I'll have a link in the description for how you can still snag a copy for yourself. And if you're craving even more tips and advice videos from yours truly, I have an entire playlist of art and comic tutorials on my channel, so go take a peek at some of those if you're interested. Anyway, that's all from me. Take care, friends, and go make a heckin' webcomic! And also buy my book! Okay, bye!